Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar titled Leadership Within Residence Hall Councils, Implications for Practice. So my name is Lori Sabata, and I'll be serving as your technical producer for the broadcast today. And before I get started, and as my first official duty, I'd like to make sure that our listening audience can see the screen. We should be seeing all of us, all of the panelists, online, and that you can hear my voice. So if you can say yes to both of those, I'd like to direct your attention to your control panel. It's really more like a ribbon than a panel. Mine's located at the bottom of the screen. Yours might be in other areas. There should be a little sort of like a cartoon hand there. If you could click on that, that lets me know that you can indeed see and hear. And I'm seeing lots of raised hands, so that's great news. Thank you so much for doing that. So our audience is on a listen-only mode today. So that means that we'll have time for content and presentation and some slides for the first portion. And at the end, the way that we'll do questions and discussion is you should also, once again, look at your control ribbon, and you'll find a little box there that it might say questions and answer, or it might say chat. You can go ahead and submit your questions via that chat box. And actually, you can submit the questions at any time as you think of them. You don't have to wait till the end to submit your questions, and we'll be monitoring those. And we'll definitely take some time at the end of the presentation to address any questions that you have. And I think we're going to have a little bit of some, audience participation, a little bit of interactivity here and there. So be ready for that as well. So also at any time, if you have any technical issues, such as you're not seeing, the slides look like they're not advancing, or you're having some audio issues, those do happen from time to time, please feel free to use your chat box. You can send a message directly to me through the chat, and I'll attempt to assist you with any issues that you may be having. I wanted to also mention that we'll be recording the webinar today. So for any colleagues you have that might have missed the presentation, or if you want to go back and view it again, we'll be sending out a link to that recording within a day or so after the webinar, and so you'll be able to use that as well. So I know that we have a lot that we want to get through today, so I am going to go ahead and turn it over to my colleague Emily Glenn, who will introduce our presenters for today. Welcome, Emily.
Thank you. Today's webinar is based on a study funded by the Association in October 2018. The funded research grant program began in 2015 and is sponsored by the Ikuhuai Foundation and bedloft.com. Grants are available all levels of researchers, and awards of up to $7,000 are available. The next round of applications will be accepted March 10th through April 19th. If you would like more information about the funded research grant program, you can email research@ikuhuai.org. This time, I will turn it over to primary investigator Dr. Darren Pierre, clinical assistant professor of higher education at Loyola University Chicago, and his colleagues, Jessica Avila Cuevas, Chicago Regional Representative for the Office of Undergraduate Admissions at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, Shelby Elkins, the Resident Director of Loyola University Chicago's Rome Center in Rome, Italy, and Jayla Beeler, Coordinator for Residence Life at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro, to share more about their work. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. And as Emily said before, my name is Dr. Darren Pierre, and I serve as a clinical assistant professor here in the higher education program at Loyola University Chicago. I want to give my esteemed colleagues an opportunity to reintroduce themselves again. And I'm going to put them on the spot for a moment because I'm going to introduce themselves and answer the question, what brought them to this study? So why did they decide to participate in this study?
Oh, can anyone hear Jessica?
No.
Okay,
No,
Jessica, we can't hear you. Nope, looks like your audio went out.
Well, maybe while we wait for Jessica's audio, maybe we can start with Jayla.
Yes. So hi, everyone. My name is Jayla Beeler. Like they said, I currently work at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro in their Housing and Residence Life Department. So I was a approached by my lovely professor, Darren Pierre, while I was in my master's program to kind of do this study. And I think it's very important for us, or for me specifically, to be involved in this kind of research, because student leadership is really a passion area of mine. And I know that not just working in housing, but all over campus, it is important to see how students identify with leadership. And so I was interested to see how we translate leadership in the residence halls, but also how this can translate across campus as we do our daily work. Shelby.
Hi, my name is Shelby Elkins. I serve as the resident director at the Loyola University Chicago John Felice Rome Center in Rome, Italy. The majority of our students are American, but we work with abroad students as well, so it's a very unique place to be. In my previous role, I advised 2 large hall councils in Chicago at Chicago's Loyola University Chicago's main campus, and was also approached by Dr. Pierre to work on the study, which I was very passionate about because it really tied into the student population that I was currently working with, where I wanted to learn the results, the positives and the letdowns of the work that we were doing. So I'm glad that we have reached the climax.
All right, can everyone hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Sorry, I apologize for the technical difficulties. So my name is Jessica Avila Cuevas, and I am a regional representative for the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. I don't have professional experience in residence life, but I did have that as an undergraduate student. I was actually a part of a hall council. So that's what really sparked my interest in this research study. And Dr. Pierre also approached to me if I am interested, since I am also interested in conducting research and kind of being involved in academia in the future ahead. So I'm really excited for this research study. I think our my colleagues here did a great job facilitating this. So I'm really excited to provide you all with the findings that we got.
So let me take a moment and talk to you about the topics we're going to cover this afternoon for a little while today. So we're going to start with the opening question, and that really have to give some thanks to Shelby for that. Shelby, Jessica, and Jayla were all in a leadership class I teach in our higher education program at Loyola. And one of the central questions that came up as we thought about applying for this grant through QI was, how do students and residence hall councils talk about leadership? And for me as a professor, I thought it was a great exercise for us to engage in this research, because I want to know, is theory really showing up in practice? We talk about leadership in these certain ways that we'll talk about in a little bit. Are students actually articulating that in the ways that we talk about in the classroom setting? And in addition, what are the implications for those who are working in residence life and how they support the leadership development of the residents and the student leaders who serve in hall council? So that's kind of our opening question. We're going to take some time to talk about the methods. We're going to give you an overview of some of the supporting literature that helps not only frame how we thought about approaching data collection, but also certainly was supported in some of the findings that we're going to talk about later. What do we know really covers the broad themes that we came up with from our findings. We're going to share some really powerful quotes from students that I think in a dynamic way show implications for practice. And then we're going to open it up for questions for you all towards the end. Before we dive too much into it though, I want to hear from you. Why did you decide to join this webinar? So if you can put in the chat box some of the reasons why you decided to participate in this today. What are your hopes to get out of it? As it says here on the screen, we really want to help shape the conversation to your direct needs and the things that you're looking to get out of this conversation. So if you could put a couple of those in the chat box, that'd be great. How to keep students motivated. Yes, absolutely. How to be more intentional with our student leaders. Yes. Best practices for advising hall councils. Yes, yes, and yes. All three of those, I think, hit with where we're trying to go today. Let's see a couple of others. How are we advising hall councils in a similar fashion? Absolutely. How to incorporate hall councils in residence hall curriculum? Absolutely. That's a great one. And then I think I'll read 2 or 3 more. How to keep energy of how to keep people motivated. Yes, enthusiasm from amongst advisors, absolutely. These will be, continue to keep these going as we go through the presentation. I'll continue to look at this chat box and make sure we try to do the best we can in our time together to address many of the things that you brought up here.
Alrighty. To give you a basis of how our study was conducted, I think it's important for you to understand the methods that we use to conduct our research, and the way that we got the data that we're going to be sharing today. So we really wanted to start with a qualitative study where we were getting lots of information from students about their specific experiences that we could turn into implications for practice, for you to use as advisors in your work every day. So we recruited students from various institutions. They were public institutions, private institutions, large institutions, small, medium, etc. Various students from the same hall councils, but also different councils at the same university, because as you might know, some universities will have different hall councils broken down by the residence hall the students live in, and then they might have a large RHA which encompasses every residence hall, etc. We then conducted interviews with them. They were done over Zoom, where we had a set of questions that we went through. We had our questions transcribed, and then we reviewed that data. And that brought us to our findings, which we're going to discuss today, where we were able to link it to the literature and really apply practice to theory. No, theory to practice. There we go. So that was the method that we wanted to use, so that we can make sure that we're putting value in our students' experience, not putting them into numbers, but quotes and implications for practice for advisors as well.
We're going to talk a little bit about the supporting literature that helped frame our conversation. And one of the things I want to reiterate that Shelby hit on so nicely was we did do this at 3 institutions, and that's really important. They were different geographical locations, type of institution, and size and scope. And so as we go into the findings later, I really want you to keep in mind that this represents a diverse set of communities, because I recognize that those who are on the webinar today come from various institutions, large, small, public versus private. And so know that the findings that we have, I think, do a solid job of identifying thoughts from students from diverse types of institutions. I want to first hit on the relational leadership model as one of the first leadership pieces that we're going to talk about. Now, I also want to caveat that I'm a firm believer that leadership is something where you need to take a little bit of one theory and a little bit of another and a little bit of another to make it work powerfully. So a lot of the theories that we're going to cover, you may have utilized, and sometimes you may have utilized those in solitude, but I would say that to have a really comprehensive thought process around leadership, you've got to take a little bit from each of the models we cover here today and others. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the other theories in a moment. The first one I want to hit on is the relational leadership model. This was developed by Nance Lucas and Susan Comazez. This relational leadership model really talks about how leadership is a process. It occurs in groups, and it involves awareness not only of self, but also of others, and appreciation of difference. And so you see here, the outside circle speaks to the process. Leadership also involves ethics, because leadership moves towards a common good, inclusive of diverse ideas and perspectives. If some of y'all are familiar with Susan Comazez's work, she does a lot with the social change model, which I'll talk about in a moment. But in this model, we talk about inclusiveness, similar to how we talk about controversy with civility in the other model. It's empowering, and it moves towards a common purpose. And that leadership cannot take place outside of groups and teams. So again, leadership is a process. It occurs in groups and moves towards a common good. Those are some of the pieces that come out of relational leadership model. And I would invite you, as you look at this visual, to think about how would I then see this play out in the day-to-day work of my hall council leadership? How are they thinking about the common purpose of their work? How are we being inclusive of new members just as much as older members? How are older members being empowering of the younger members? And how are they doing this all with a sense of ethics? And as advisors, how are we honoring that leadership is a process, and it's an iterative process at that, and so that students may not all get it on the first try. So that's something to consider as we talk about the relational leadership model. I mentioned before, and I want to go into more detail now, the social change model of the leadership. The social change model of leadership is probably the most well-cited model of leadership that we know of in U.S. higher education. Shelby, would you mind changing that slide for me? Thank you so much. The model is broken up into 3 areas: individual values, group values, and societal and community values. The social change model says we start with the individual, we then move to the group, and then we move to this collective place of positive change for the communities that we are a part of. I want to just quickly hit on the 7 C's: conscious of self, congruence, commitment, collaboration, common purpose, controversy with civility. Those are the 3 group values. Then the final of the C's within societal community values is citizenship. With the 8th C, that kind of goes without being said, is change. And so as you think about your work in residence life with our hall councils, think about how they start off maybe in their first year really learning who they are, really thinking about what are the things that they appreciate and enjoy. How does that then connect to their rationale and reasoning for joining hall council, which connects to the group values? And then how are they continually reminded that what they're doing in a hall council is bigger than simply putting on programs for the members of their community, but they are really supporting people engaging in some sort of a community. So there's a higher purpose to the work. So thinking about the individual, the group, and society are some of the main components of the social change model.
All right, so the next theoretical background that we kind of decided on for this particular study was leadership identity development, otherwise known as LID. So here you'll see this visual. It's kind of funky here, but we're going to mostly focus on the leadership identity stages. So essentially, leadership identity development is a developmental process or stages that captures the varying experiences that college students undergo as they situate themselves in the context of leadership. And so really to help us understand the experiences in creating leadership identity. So there are 6 stages of it. First, we look at the awareness or developing a sense of self-awareness. Next is the exploration or engagement stage. Then leaders are identified. So how do I see myself as a leader? And then the next stages follow with leadership differentiated. So they're picking what kind of leadership position they may want to pursue, and generativity, and then integration. So now they're putting it into place. So really each stage of leadership identity interacts with 5 categories. So as you see here, on the white boxes around this graphic, that essentially influence the development of their leadership identity. So whether if it's developing self, group influences, changing view of self with others, broadening views of leadership and developmental influences. So really this model is based on stages explaining how individuals progress through one stage before beginning to the next. Now, it is essential, though, to really think about the environmental factors and each individual's readiness to advance to the next stage. So when in the context of hall counselors, resident hall councils, I'm sorry, you know, it's important to kind of see like what type of environment they're in, and that way they can bring this sense of leadership to the next level. So really this particular model allows for stages to be repeated, and in each return, the individual may experience that stage with a deeper and more complex understanding. So as educators, you know, we must understand that leadership identity development is a complex, evolving process. So as we all know, you know, leadership is transitional. And really, although this model can be described in a linear fashion, leadership development process does not move through it like in a straight line. So really these stages are fluid. Students can move between them depending on their experiences and the successes or challenges that they may face. So it is important to us to really think about, the fluidity when it comes to, as they are kind of being aware and exposed to different leadership levels, even within the residence hall councils.
So Jessica touched on about how leadership is the personal level and identity, and so the next model we're going to look at is culturally relevant leadership, and that kind of looks at how all of these factors are tied in together, not only the individual or the student, but how outside factors also play a role into how student leaders see leadership and engage and act in leadership. So when we look at culturally relevant leadership, it kind of sets the framework for like how we as student affairs professionals and educators can transform our current leadership practices to account for all of the outside factors that are taking place at our institutions, in our specific residence halls, and our specific departments. So the cultural relevant leadership model is made up of 5 domains. And so understanding how each of these domains play a factor into how students see leadership gives us a better understanding of how students, one, identify, but also how they learn about leadership, and how what we do in our leadership roles and in our practices plays a role. Us as educators have to be accepting and recognizing and cognizant of the diversity that our students exhibit. And so with that in mind, we will jump right into the model. So in the middle, you see the individual box and the leadership process box, and the identity, the capacity, and efficacy roles, and how they each will play into the larger domains on the side. So Jessica touched a little bit about this, and how identity is exactly how it is described. It's how residents or students see themselves in leadership. Like, how do I define leadership? Who do I see as a leader, and how does that influence how I play a part in our leadership roles? Capacity is how do students integrate the knowledge that they have of leadership, their attitudes towards leadership, and their overall ability to engage in leadership. So what does that really say to them? Like, how do they think, oh, I see these leaders on campus, so then how can I actively engage or support that? And then efficacy is the students' or the residents' belief and how they can be successful in actually doing leadership. So all of this plays into the leadership process and how students engage in their leadership identity throughout their time at our institutions. So together, successful leadership, I should say, doesn't just happen on the individual level. It's a culmination in tandem with outside factors. So if we look at the 5 domains of leadership on the side of this kind of house model, we see historical legacy is the first one. And so in talking about that, it is historically leadership has excluded marginalized students or students of color. And so how are we now in 2020 reversing that narrative or dismantling that narrative? So for example, how do we as an institution support students of color or support marginalized students so that they can then see themselves as leaders on campus? What do we have on campus that plays a part in how students feel included or excluded? Do we still have statues or buildings that still support exclusion, or how students of color were once not accepted? Or are we actively doing things to engage and tear down that narrative? The next one is compositional diversity, and that is the number of proportional students in our student groups. Do we have a solid amount of diversity represented? Do students really see themselves in the student groups represented? Do they see themselves in RHA and hall councils? I recently attended a presentation by one of my colleagues about the Latinx experience. And so how are we meeting students where they are in their leadership journey so they can actively see a good representation of themselves? On the right side, it's the behavioral dimension. And that kind of talks about the interaction of diversity. So how do students interact with each other from different varying backgrounds? Are they experiencing microaggressions in the classroom or in their RHA or NIHH exec board meetings, or are they able to collectively coexist and find really great ways to provide active change in the classroom or outside the classroom in the residence halls? On the left side is the psychological dimension, and that really talks about an individual's view. So how diverse is our student body, how diverse is our student group, and how are these students really seeing themselves to make them actively want to engage in leadership. It's our responsibility as institutions and as student affairs professionals and as leaders to really make sure we are representing a diverse group of students, so that all students feel like they can do leadership, so all students feel like leadership is something that they have within themselves. And then lastly, the organizational and structural dimension talks about how we as an institution are actively perpetuating that. Do we have diversity in our administration? Do we have diversity on campus? Are students seeing a representation of themselves in the leadership that they see every day, that's sending them emails, that are putting on programs? So if we say we're about diversity and inclusion, and our mission and values are stating that as well, are we actively doing that so students see it, so they want to engage in leadership and take an active role in that as well? So taking all of this together, as student affairs professionals, we can begin to transform our leadership practices, our NRHH, our hall councils, our fraternity and sorority life offices, to begin helping students see themselves in the leadership roles that they want to see themselves in.
So as we transition into the core findings of our study, we wanted to start by talking about some of the main themes that we got from the data before we go into specific quotes or examples from the students. So starting from the beginning, students for the majority did not see a leader as a positional role. So I think everyone can take this very differently depending on how their hall council is structured. But for the students we were working with, it didn't matter if they were the president or a representative of a specific residence hall floor, things like that. It didn't matter what position they were in, they were a leader within the hall council or within their residence hall. I think that can also play into the way that they are advised by an advisor. So treating and respecting the members of your hall council equally, as in not only having one-on-ones with your president, but having one-on-ones with representatives to learn where they are in their journey, how you can assist them, how they feel included in the council, how are they bonding with people inside and outside of the council, etc. Find different ways to make sure that they feel that they don't have to be the president to be the leader. The second one is a lot of the students that we interviewed joined hall council to meet other people. So they're all coming to hall council for very different reasons. Some of them think that that's the way that they can become an RA the next year. Some of them were on student government in high school, different things like that. But one of the core components was they knew that joining hall council at the very beginning of their time in the residence hall was an immediate way to join a club of some sort to meet different people.
Shelby,
yeah.
So we got a question. Do you have in front of you the interview protocol? Someone asked what were some of the key questions that we asked students. So we will share those with you all.
So we were asking, we started off specifically with learning about how they viewed leadership, with some probing questions regarding what role has your involvement in hall council played in the ways that you view leadership? And then also, are there more advisors / administrators? Is there more that advisors and administrators can do to cultivate leadership development for hall council representatives? We also wanted to dive into the role that leadership played in their decision to be involved in the hall council. So were there other motivating factors that contributed to the decision to get involved? Now, having served on hall council, have you seen leadership growth and development within themselves? So we went into a reflection period with the students. We had two final sections that we were interviewing them on regarding what are the ways that the experience could further enhance their view of leadership? So how could we enhance their experience as being a member of a hall council? And then also what advice they had for advisors or directors, student affairs administrators, so that we could have more practical examples of, I really wish my advisor had a one-on-one with me. I really wish they had actually come to our weekly meetings, things like that, so that we could give more concrete examples. Okay, thank you, Darren, for letting me know if something pops up in the chat. I can't see it, but thank you. Advisors can serve as mentors, encouraging community, etc. We saw a lot of our participants were talking about how their advisors were actively involved in their process. So not having a hall council that they technically advise, but they're not participating and putting full faith in all the things that they do. I think it's important to remember that oftentimes a lot of these students are newer to the university. This might be the first organization that they're involved in, and it's okay for them to have a guiding hand and someone that shows that they believe in them, that they can encourage their work. They can say, hey, that might not be the best idea, but maybe this will work. Or these are extra resources we have to really make you flourish in this position and grow and learn specifically for what they need to grow in. So always remember that your role is very versatile. That changes with how the hall council is, how your position is organized, things like that. But that was one of our takeaways. Also majors. So students came from various academic majors. I think sometimes in student affairs, we think that our most valuable students might be students who are in the arts or different things like that because they're more involved or they might have more free time. And we did not see that at all. So we saw students in all positions of hall council that were STEM majors, they were in biology, there were dance majors, there was everything. So we thought that was an important reminder for student affairs practitioners to remember no students are excluded from this process because of their majors, and they can really come from any background. Anything to add about the major themes before we move into findings?
No, Shelby, I can touch on some other things when I talk about the findings.
Va bene.
So the way I thought it'd be great for us to talk about findings would be to talk about some of the quotes that came from the study itself. So here are some of the ways participants discuss leadership. And as we're talking about this, I want you to keep in mind a couple of things. First is earlier when we talked about what we know from the themes, we talked about advisors can serve as mentors, encouraging community and fostering an environment with challenging questions and discussions. That connects directly to what Jessica was talking about with the LID model. A lot of the students who come into this conversation are coming in not even necessarily seeing themselves as a leader. As Shelby had mentioned before, many come in just looking to build community. But I think several of them left feeling much different about that, going to those later stages that were discussed in the LEAD model. The other piece is, as we talk about how students discuss leadership, is to continue to keep in mind the McMahon, Comavez, and Lucas model of relational leadership, which talks about leadership as a process. So participants, one of the participants says, it's more than just showing people how to act, it's living it in yourself and feel like you're showing up through who you are as a person. You know, when Jayla spoke about culture relevant leadership learning, it's so important that we talk about identity, and especially those who come from minoritized communities in this conversation, because the first piece of the social change model is conscious of self. And self-awareness is one of the hallmarks of many leadership theories. And so to talk about leadership without having a conversation about who are you, extrinsically and intrinsically, I think is important. A part of leadership is knowing your team. So that connects directly back to that relational leadership model that talks about leadership to take place in groups. And then there's a final quote here as students talked about how they discuss leadership. Leadership to me, and this was from Taylor, leadership to me, I think it's not just one person demanding or directing everything. It's more about how can you be a part of the group and making sure within the group, everyone is heard and that what the group is working towards is efficient. So, you know, I think two things occurred for me when we were going through the data and we were doing interviews with students is one of the things that this is generational. And so as we look at millennials moving into Gen Z, there is a much greater value for things that are done in groups and teams versus done at the individual. So you see that in many of the comments here. Another is that for many communities, and particularly communities of color, leadership is not seen in a positional format. And so we've really got to continue to dismantle some of those thoughts around who is a leader and then what does that leader look like, because I think that those are key considerations for us as we move forward. The next part that I want to go to is this implication for advisors. And I think that when Shelby was going over our protocol, one of the things that was critically important for us was not only figure out how students were talking about leadership for themselves, but also what were the ways in which they were seeing that supported or could have been supported further by those advisors who they worked closely with in their hall councils. And so this first one was, what made me grow is that I was not spoon-fed the answers. I was challenged to look at things my own way. We only picked out a couple of quotes, but these quotes are thematic representations of what a host student said. I don't want you to tell me how to do it. I want to be empowered. So asking questions. And I think that this is a great opportunity for those of us who work in residence life to really celebrate our roles as educators. We're not there to dictate or mandate. We are really there to take these as learning opportunities for our students. And I thought Jordan's response to that question really honored that. From Tam, I really liked what he did. He wasn't just, he referring to their Residence Hall Council advisors. I really liked what he did. He wasn't there to necessarily lead us. Instead of telling us what to do, he just kind of guided us. And it didn't seem like he was in charge, but at the same time he was. But he was there to facilitate the conversation. Another student wrote, I personally never spoke to my hall council advisor, not as a resident, not as a person in hall council, maybe in a group conversation, but never directly. And so I think that lack of communication played a role in my lack of knowledge about what expectations were to be held of me. Dana, I felt like in that interview spoke to this idea of apathy. And I think someone said, how do we keep students engaged? Well, one is I think we can really trouble how we engage in relationships with our hall council leadership, because what Dana spoke to was really, I didn't know this role. I didn't feel much support. And I think Dana would do a self-assessment and say, and they did, and because of those things, did not show up as their very best. So as hall council advisors, how are we doing, as Nevitt Sanford talks about so well, that great idea of challenge and support? How are we there to allow them to have these moments to grow and to experience things as Jordan talks about, but how are we there to also be there in a supportive manner so that students have a realistic understanding about the roles, the expectations, and they're able to build a relationship with you, because you saw from our earlier things that seeing you, those who work in residence hall councils as advisors, they see you as mentors. And so really honor that invitation they give you before they may even join residence hall council. And then being said, in terms of advisors, they didn't do much for leadership development. And I think that we saw at one institution where students seemed to talk really in strong terms about their relationship with their residence hall council leadership, and another institution that it was different. Perhaps one of those differences, and we could lean more into this, was institutional size. So one is a large public, one is a more mid-sized private, where we saw these stark delineations in terms of how students talked about their relationship. So those of you who work at large institutions, I would say that there's a greater need to think about how do you make concerted efforts to build relationships with your hall councils and to build relationships with your residents, because it was seen at the larger institution that those were the things that were a little bit more challenged. Whereas I could see at a mid-sized or smaller institution, those relationships may happen more organically. Jayla, Jessica, Shelby, anything from the findings around how students talked about leadership or implications for advisors that you want to add on to?
I think something that stood out to me was all of the students that we were interviewing were also participating in other extracurricular activities. So they were coming from not only diverse backgrounds of their lives, but on campus as well. So they talked about how that affected the way that they participated in the hall council they were participating in, how their advisor interacted with them regarding flexibility, the way that they were able to stay on the council, or whether it was too much for them depending on the requirements of that. So my takeaway from that for putting it into practice was once you have your hall council, take into account who's on your hall council, what other things are they working with, and how can we best suit the entire team so that we can keep that same team. So I think someone asked about retention as well of people on hall council. I think a specific example would be, you might say that every hall council meeting has to be 3 p.m. on a Tuesday, but if you get your full council and you see that everyone is available at 4 o'clock on a Thursday, it might be better to adjust that and you be flexible as an advisor to make sure you're retaining your people while accommodating their other extracurricular activities.
And I so appreciate Shelby bringing this up, because that means that you all should be working in partnership with those who work in student activities and leadership programs. One of our participants said that where they learned leadership most was in their sorority and on Residence Hall Council leadership. So we are doing leadership within residence life. And I think sometimes we think, okay, the leadership department or student activities, there's where leadership is taking place, or it's in this club and organization. But for the students in our study, they were participating in all of these. So the ways in which we talk about leadership, I hope, has consistency across the area that you work in. So whether it's in residence life or student activities, we're all talking about leadership with this common idea, this common vernacular, so that students are getting this leadership development and leadership education in a consistent manner across areas of your unit or division.
Yeah, and I think that I would just add, so I find it really interesting when we talk about like supporting students of color and things of that nature, that it's really important, like Shelby said, to take into account what the makeup of your RHA or student organization is, and then be mindful of the things that they may be involved in. I talked about earlier how I had a colleague who presented on supporting Latinx students. And something that really important, or something really interesting that I thought that she talked about, was a lot of our Latinx students also are supporting their families, or might be doing things to support their families while they're in school. And so how do you, as an advisor or an educator or a residence hall director, be mindful of, yes, this student may also want to be a part of hall council or be involved as a RA, but they also have family obligations that they are kind of tied to. So how do you then support them in these endeavors while also making them feel like, yes, leadership is still capable for them to be achieving, maybe not at an RHA level, maybe not as at the RA level, but in various other organizations on campus.
Someone asked the question, what would we do in terms of marketing if I was trying to market and recruit people? And two things that came to mind for me, and I certainly invite my colleagues to share their thoughts on this, that came up from the conversations, is one, going back to one of the findings that Shelby mentioned, which is community. A lot of the students who joined decided to join because of community. And the second is that there's transferable skills. So someone asked earlier, what was the makeup of our students? Like, did we have first years? We didn't really have any first year students, because our students had either just finished up their first year on hall council, which then put them in a second year. But we did have everything from second year to I'm getting ready to graduate. And those who were in that latter place of getting ready to graduate, they saw themselves as empowering others to be leaders. They saw that there was transferability around their ways to speak to their interpersonal skills. They could see how what they learned in residence hall council was now showing up in the ways in which they were leading other student organizations. So if I was going to market the opportunity to be on residence hall council based on the findings of our study, those would be the twofold approach I would take. One is, this is a great way to continue to build community. The second is, this is going to be a great way to build transferable skills that will support you in your work in other student organizations and beyond, because some of the people who were now in those fourth year experiences are now trying to figure out, how do I talk about residence hall council as I'm going for graduate school interviews, as I'm going into the job market. So those would be two places that I would speak to. I just want to end with this quote, kind of like a food for thought. I would say, this was for one of our research participants, I would say it enhanced and kind of chiseled away at my previous idea of what leadership was. This is talking about the experience on residence hall council, and the way that I thought that leadership was just somebody who everybody followed, when that's not what it is at all. Students are getting more from it. It goes back to what Jessica talked about with the LID model around at the beginning. It's just like, okay, what's a positional leader? To, there's something bigger than this. And my thoughts around leadership have totally changed after being part of this experience. And I think that whoever this hall council member's advisor was can feel good that this is where we want students to get to around leadership. We want to chisel away around some of those prototypes that Jayla talks about when we talk about who's not and who has been represented. We want to get away from leadership being positional, as we talked about in the relational leadership model. We want to get away from leadership as someone else, but it's all of us. That's talked about in the social change model. And we want to get away from leadership as them, not me, as talked about in the LID model. And if we're doing those things, then I think we're doing incredible work as educators to cultivate the next generation of leaders.
We wanted to make sure we set aside some time for questions, so we have about 15 minutes, I think. So feel free to drop any questions in the chat box and we will popcorn through those. Some of the things that I've already started reading in the chat box, I think we might have answers to, but they might not come from the data of our specific research since it was regarding leadership development, et cetera. But we might give you some tips or tricks from our personal experience while working with hall councils. So feel free to start dropping some questions and we'll come through things that are already in there and give any feedback. I can kick it off by, I saw a question, it was from Tori. Tying hall councils, hall leadership into a residential curriculum model. We did not talk about that, and I did not really see that in any of the research that we did. But I can speak from personal experience. When I was advising a hall council, I tried to create a specific residential curriculum model to ensure that our hall council was reaching the learning objectives that were not being completed by the RAs. So I did not want the hall council to be mimicking or doing the exact same things as the RAs, but I also did not want the hall council to only be planning socials. So thinking about what were the gaps that I was seeing in department-wide residential curriculum and filling that in with the hall council, specifically because we were working with upperclassmen. And I made that on my own for every semester, every semester that we were in. I also worked at a Jesuit institution, so we had other topics that we needed to cover, but that worked well. And I think that the students also appreciated that because they did not have to ask every meeting of what's coming up. They were able to see for the full semester what the expectations were when a specific event or program needed to be planned by, when the forms were due, things like that. And I think that made their entire time much easier and also showed them how what the benefits of organization are.
Someone asked the question, did we ask them about compensation? We didn't ask about compensation, but what I think is notable, and it could be for two reasons, so I want to acknowledge it, and I'll give two thoughts about it. Did not come up in a moment, but we didn't ask the question and it didn't come up. So students didn't say, you know, compensation is why I joined Residence Hall Council or why I decided to continue to stay involved. One of those thoughts I have is that I think whether you're giving compensation or whether you're offering compensation or not, there's going to be something bigger that retains students in this process. One of the things we have to acknowledge is that we send out this invitation to different residence communities, as we said, at various institutions. Those students who respond, inevitably they have energy around this conversation. So the fact that they have energy around it acknowledges that there's a commitment. And so for me, I think the reason why compensation may not have come up is because there's something bigger than a monetary piece that is connecting them to this experience. And the other is that, you know, I think we would have to trouble and parcel the institutional demographics based on student population and think about what is the social economic status of the students who are there. We didn't get to any of those questions. So perhaps if we had a student population that came from a lower SDF community, that may have come up more. And so we didn't trouble the demographics of the institution itself to be able to parcel out if there may be price elasticity around being involved on campus. Because certainly if you're at a school that has a low SDF population, they may not even be involved on campus because needing to have a job outside of the institution or carry a work study position may serve them from taking on opportunities like this.
I see that Justin and Lori talked about retention and also declining numbers within their hall councils. I'm sure there's many reasons of why that could possibly be, or individual student experiences. But something that I would do with my hall council members to ensure that they felt connected with the team and with me was I kind of mimicked the RA requirements, but made them less because they're not RAs, of course. So every member from the bottom to the top all had one-on-one meetings with me. Of course, they were less frequent. It might be once a month, or the president might be like every 2 weeks. But I think that created the mentality of like, this is a real role. I'm being held accountable. I'm being guided, and someone's investing in my time. I think that helped retain them while I was also hearing what was going on with them and could adjust what was expected of them. I think also starting from the very beginning, I was privileged enough to work at an institution where we had a pretty decent budget for our hall council. So we were able to plan a summit at the beginning to begin their development and growth with the team. So even as small as like $100, if that's you catering something, and the first meeting is a social for your just for your hall council. I think not everything they do has to be done for the entire residence hall. So if you can find a small chunk of that budget to find an opportunity for the team members to bond and grow together, I think from there on out, they're going to be able to plan better programs and achieve those learning objectives if they like each other and know the strengths and weaknesses of each other as well.
And
Yeah,
oh, go ahead.
Oh yeah, just to piggyback a little bit off what Shelby talked about, I know that for me in my current position and when I was a grad assistant at Loyola, we did have a lot. I worked in an upper class community, and so having a lot of students leave the position for various reasons was often because they weren't expecting it to be as heavy of a position as they thought it would be. And so I think that finding students, like Shelby said, who are truly interested in serving in their communities is really important. I think that currently right now in my hall council, I have a president who's really passionate about being a student leader, but not necessarily in the RA role. And so I think that that has helped retain a lot of my executive board members because their peer is really passionate about the work that they're doing as a hall council president. And so in tandem, or as a result, they have also been able to motivate their peers to want to plan programs, to want to engage in like leading meetings and do other professional development opportunities within their own hall council. So I think that that's really important to find people who are really passionate about it. And sometimes that doesn't happen in the first semester. So just keeping that in mind, like don't take it as a bad thing if you do lose a lot of members, because sometimes they just really aren't aware of the responsibilities that they hold. But I wouldn't say, like, as an advisor, you should take it to heart, because sometimes students may have other obligations that they need to fulfill so they can't continue on. So just really just thinking about like the larger picture and all the things that may play into that.
And there was a question offered about what conversation did we have with advisors. I think, you know, with any good study, it's like future areas for research. And the future area of research for this one will be doing a study on hall council advisors and their thoughts about their roles and their thoughts about leadership, because this study focused primarily on students. That was who we were looking at, were students who participate in hall council, not necessarily their advisors. But I do think that's a great study for us to continue with. And the other piece with that is because I think the big question that I think if you're advising or you're supervising those who work with hall councils, ask them, do you see yourself as a leadership educator? And if their answer to that question is no, then that's something in of itself you want to problematize, because leadership is taking place everywhere. And all of our participants were not only involved in hall council, but they were also involved in other organizations. And they all attributed their leadership efficacy to being involved in hall council. So a great question to start with for those of you who supervise hall council advisors is, do you see yourself as a leadership educator? What is your understanding of some of the theories we covered today? Because leadership is taking place all over.
For the second part of your question, Heather, Jayla and I worked together in our previous role. And when we did our summer training before the school year started, we were given training as hall council advisors as well, even though we were also supervising the RAs. So we made sure that our staff was trained on that before the students ever showed up. And we were also given our own version of residential curriculum of the expectations from us as advisors. So I think less autonomy might be more beneficial to ensure that advisors are achieving their objectives with the Hall Council instead of just having a committee that makes recommendations. While also, I think effective training for RDs or whoever's advising the Hall Council is also letting those people know what the limits are. So if a Hall Council really has the power to make laundry machines free, they should know that. So if I know that they can do that, then I'm more empowered to make sure that they're developing conversations of how can they really impact the residence hall. And if all they really are allowed to do is plan a program, then I would need to know that, and it would need to be incorporated into training. But I think incorporating that into your staff training would be very beneficial.
I see that Tori wrote a question about was there any look at how individual hall councils connect to larger residential leadership organizations. So here at UNCG, and I can't speak to this from Loyola because I didn't see it firsthand, but here at UNCG, every Monday, our hall council presidents and our individual hall council presidents in our residence halls meet at a general assembly with our larger RHA organization. And then that is really where they get down to for lack of a better word, the nitty gritty of what's going on in the residence halls. And that in that moment is where they're able to sort of benchmark where they can enact change. So for example, all of our residence halls on campus don't have print stations where students can pay to print in their residence halls. But I know that my hall council president in the fall brought that up at an RHA General Assembly meeting because they wanted to get one in our residence hall. And so it was in that meeting that the president of RHA was like, okay, this is something really interesting. And so now in the spring, we were able to get a print station in our residence hall. So I think that the connection or the lack thereof with RHA is really important because that larger student umbrella can in some ways have a greater impact at the university level to better enact change that residents are wanting to see, if that makes sense.
Tyler Priest mentioned how to build enthusiasm and support among advisors. One of my characteristics is competition. And I knew going in that at our end of the year banquet for Residence Life, there was the Best Hall Council Award, but also the Best Hall Council Advisor. So I think it built enthusiasm for me to make sure that we were on top of our game. We knew what the end goal was, of course, to create a great experience for students, but we would like to be recognized at the end because everyone likes recognition when they deserve it. So I think that might be something that you could add if it doesn't already exist, and make sure people know that they don't want to get to the end of the year and they're like, oh, I could have worked my tail off and gotten a $3 plaque. So that would be my advice for them.
Yeah, and Stephen had mentioned, very interesting in doing research on residential leadership advising and the growing trends and implications thereof. I think, Darren said, this just scratches the surface in the conversation. And as professionals, I appreciate Shelby and Jayla bringing, their perspective in how they utilized, advising these hall councils. And, this is sort of the spark of the conversation for those of you who are interested in professional development. Each and every of our institutions work and operate differently. So first you may want to reflect, okay, what kinds of opportunities can I do now, even if it's limited funds, or how can I bring people together and sort of create a structured hall council if that's what you want, or how can I market this to students who may be interested in joining, and then perhaps establish conversations with other professionals from similar schools or various schools, depending on what you're looking for. So hopefully this kind of brought in some good insight in again, sparking that conversation. Hopefully we can go towards more research, especially when interviewing advisors, to see how they made of their leadership development in advising these hall councils.
And I think for all of you, I hope you accept the invitation to continue this work further. What was beautiful about this team was it was a diverse team. Jayla and Shelby have direct experience, and Jessica and I bring in a unique perspective of someone who's outside of residence life. And so when you're thinking about doing this work, who are some other people in your university setting who might want to engage in this conversation with you. And don't just think of it in a siloed place of like, okay, well, let me get these people present for life. There may be other people in other parts of the university who might want to engage in this with you, because there's implications for all of us, as you see from our findings, as it relates to working and supporting students.
Matt talked about you're beginning to look at how you solidify leadership and what it means in your department while trying to instill Jesuit values. I think one thing that Hall Council members often think is they're trying to see the difference between them and RAs and what's expected of RAs versus them, especially if they're working in a small residence hall where there's sometimes two competing boards of who's planning programs. I think trying to mimic that in the sense of the things that you teach RAs about when you're looking at Examine or how they're caring for themselves, caring for other people, caring for the community, all of those things, it's completely valid to do the exact same things with your Hall Council to ensure that they are not only doing a program inside your multipurpose room every other week or things like that. They can get off campus, they can care for the community, while also you as an advisor are caring for them or helping them learn ways to care for themselves. I think that those same exact skills or special monthly trainings you might do with RAs can absolutely be adapted to your Hall Council members to make sure that they're getting that same experience. Any last questions?
Well, seeing none, we will begin to wrap this up now. Again, feel free to connect with any of us after this if you have additional questions about our study. We're excited about what we found here, and importantly, we're excited about how this can support those who are working within residence hall councils, as advisors, and beyond. So thank you all for taking an opportunity to spend a little bit of time with us and have a conversation about how students in residence halls talk about leadership. So thank you very, very much, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
All right, thank you, Darren, and thank you, everyone, to all the panelists for doing such a great job of sharing your research today, and also thank you to our listening audience for joining us today. Look for that recording to come out. We'll send a link out to the recording of this webinar on YouTube, and I hope everyone has a great day. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.